Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
However, there have been a certain percentage of this volume of reports that have been made by credible observers of relatively incredible things.
2, 1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower clear.
We're having luck, but other sightings apparently were taken more seriously.
And one in particular, an incident called the Rendlesham Forest Incident, also known as Britain's Roswell. This was in 1980, shortly after Christmas, when a few American airmen who were stationed in the UK reported seeing a UFO.
A huge, solid, diamond-shaped object they described as 100 foot long, hovering silently in the sky above them.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone, whatever that means.
American public and global public finally understands UFOs are real. This is a technology that is so far beyond anything that we have.
Reportedly appear to exhibit unusual flight characteristics, appear to demonstrate advanced technology.
ARROW is the culmination of decades of DoD, intelligence community, and congressionally directed efforts to successfully resolve UAP encountered first and foremost by U.S. military.
Welcome back to Disclosure Team with me, your host, Vinnie Adams. The following is an interview with George Knapp and Colm Kelleher. In this interview, we talk about their new book, Inside the U.S. Government Covert UFO Program, Initial Revelations. I just want to say a big thank you to everybody that submitted questions, but obviously due to time limitations, I wasn't able to ask them all. Now, I did integrate some of them with the questions that I already had because a lot of them were the same. I hope you enjoy this interview with George Knapp and Colm Kelleher. So George, Colm, welcome to Disclosure Team Show. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Great to be here. I owe you.
Thank you so much. Well, listen, I'd love to just jump straight in. And Colm, you actually emailed me an article earlier today, which touches upon the comments made by Dr. Lakatsky on the Weaponized podcast, stating that the US government is in possession of a UFO or craft and have gained access to its interior. So is this something that you were already aware of or also aware of, Colm, at the time through your work with BASS and ORSAP? And if you can talk about it to any degree. And George, I'd love to know your thoughts on that statement as well. Thank you.
Well, I can tell you, and I've addressed this both on the original Weaponized show that we did with George and Jeremy all the way back in, I don't know, earlier this year, as well as the more recent Weaponized program. And that is that I am aware, but I can't talk about it. So you know, there are several layers to this whole thing. Number one is that when you publish a book and you send it through the Pentagon review process, and then the Pentagon sends it out to different Department of Homeland Security, Defense Intelligence Agency, and other places, you know, they take stuff out. They basically draw a line in the sand saying, this amount of information is okay to talk about it. But you risk a lot going beyond that line in the sand from the Pentagon, what's called DOPSR, which is the pre-publication arm of the Pentagon, because there are people watching and there are people monitoring what is going on in terms of how much you talk about it. Secondly, you know, when you get top secret SCI clearances from agencies, you go through the process of signing non-disclosure agreements. I'm currently under 3 separate non-disclosure agreements. And, there's a Bible of national security, and I'll show you this. This is the first page of a 150-page document that is in multiple volumes, and they spell out what the requirements are for holding security clearances and for managing information under security requirements. So for both the DOPSR angle and also the NISPOM and the consequences of going beyond that, I will repeat that I am aware of what you've asked, but I'm not going to talk about it anymore.
No, I appreciate that response.
I would just chime in this, it's not exactly a surprise that people have reacted as they have, that Jim Lakatsky didn't tell us everything, therefore we're not going to read his book. That is the way UFO world has always been. We pretty much knew that's the way it would go this time. It's sort of the definition of biting the hand that feeds you. This is a guy who was in charge of, created, formed, and managed the biggest acknowledged UFO program the US government has ever had. He's willing to come forward and tell what he can right up to the edge. He goes through the DOPSR process, gets permission to say what he did, takes it as far as he can. And because he does not spill everything he knows in the world, people react negatively. Oh, that dirty bastard, I'm not going to buy his book. He didn't tell us where the crash saucer is. He doesn't tell us who has it. He can't tell that stuff. He told what he can right up to the edge, and that's it. So I can understand the frustration of people out here in UFO world who'd like to know everything right now, all at once, for free. That's not how it works, though. People in that who have lived that life, who really do have those jobs, they have lives, they have families, they don't want to go to prison. So they tell what they know up to the edge, and they can't go much beyond that. Jim Lakatsky ran this huge program, which created the biggest UFO database in the history of the world, as far as we know. He is telling what he knows because DIA, to this point, will not. OSAP produced more than 100 of these gigantic reports on things like warp drive and tic tac and injuries to persons who get into proximity with UFOs, all kinds of really important topics. Not one page of that stuff has been made public by DIA. The thousands of people who filed FOIA requests cannot get any of it. DIA in response says, we don't have it. Well, they do have it. They do have it. Maybe they can't find it. They certainly don't want to release it, but they've got it. And here we got a guy who ran that program, who's telling as much as he can, and all he gets for doing so is crap. If you wonder why there's reluctance of people to come forward and say what they know about these programs, here's Exhibit A.
Yeah, I completely agree on that point. I appreciate that as well. Thank you, George. Now, the new book does focus more on the performance aspect of UFOs as opposed to the human effects and the high strangeness, which kind of was more of the focus of skinwalkers at the Pentagon. And one of the projects highlighted within OSAP was Project Physics, which does focus on the lift and propulsion, power generation, spatial temporal translation, and more. So what was learned from these studies, and can you give any examples of cases that really sort of where craft was seen or detected showing these specific traits?
Well, I guess the sort of primary case that we investigated all the way back in early 2009, and I should just mention that I was running the Las Vegas operation with 50. We had scientists, we had engineers, we had investigators, and we had security officers, we had biologists, chemists, etc. in Las Vegas, while Jim Lakatsky was running the show in Washington, D.C. I was reporting to Robert Bigelow, who was the CEO of Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies. So, one of the first things that I was tasked to do was to bring together a team of about 50 people. And so I went into aggressive hiring mode immediately I joined the team. And so one of the first people that walked into my door was interviewing for a program manager position at Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies, which was executing the OSAP program. And this guy's name was Doug Kurth. His name has gone public many times in connection with this program. So I was interviewing him, and I had basically hired him. And at the very end of the interview, he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm a retired F-18 pilot, and I was part of a really, fundamental UFO sighting off the coast of San Diego in late 2004. I was one of the pilots who was tasked to investigate this object of unknown origin, and it turned out that Doug was talking about this event that happened off the USS with the USS Nimitz and the USS Princeton off the coast of San Diego all the way back in 2004. So remember, this was December of 2008 when I was interviewing Doug. So he went through the whole process of how they launched, they had F-18s interact with this Tic Tac shaped object that displayed incredible maneuverability. It displayed all of the lift, propulsion, power generation, probably even spatial temporal translation aspects that we talk about in this new book. So it is the quintessential object that really displayed these characteristics. So anyway, long story short, I immediately reported this to Robert Bigelow. Robert Bigelow and myself got on the phone to Lekatsky in Washington, D.C. Lekatsky relayed this to a guy that we call Axelrod in our book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, who assembled a top flight team and went out and investigated, interviewed all the pilots involved with the Tic Tac incident, and interviewed all of the crew on the Princeton and also on the Nimitz, and interviewed the security personnel involved. So, all the way back in 2008, OSAP was sitting on a remarkable case because this was visually sighted, and also it showed up on multiple sensor systems on the Princeton and on the aircraft. The FLIR forward-looking infrared was capable of detecting the Tic Tac. So this was a case made in heaven, but at the time it was absolutely secret. And Axelrod and his team put together a short report that was submitted to Defense Intelligence Agency in July of 2009. And sort of 8 years later, in December of 2017, the New York Times broke the story on this whole thing and blew it wide open. But for those 8 years, a handful of people knew that this remarkable UFO case had occurred. And I would say that case is arguably one of the most well-known globally, in history. And it does fulfill all of the requirements in terms of performance characteristics and observable, really advanced acceleration, no obvious flight surfaces, ability to maneuver extremely rapidly from a zero acceleration to Mach 5, 6, pick a number. So bottom line, the Tic Tac case is a really powerful exemplar of the kinds of cases that we published in Initial Revelations. And you're right, the Initial Revelations book is a challenging read, but it's worth it. And it does focus only on UFO characteristics, UFO performance, which is a parallel track that OSAP ran, which is exactly parallel to effects of UFOs on humans. Our book, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, went into a lot of detail about the bizarre effects of UFOs on humans, everything from medical effects to, psychological effects. And ultimately, we documented paranormal phenomena. But we were essentially following the data. And, we think that this book, Initial Revelations, is really balancing the equation where, you've got a UFO program has got to look at both UFO performance, looking at it from the physics and the engineering angle, but it also has to look at UFO effects on people. And we have to follow the data. When we go down that rabbit hole of effects of UFOs on people, you've got to go down that rabbit hole, and you cannot be putting data into the garbage can just because you think that it doesn't confirm with the, what the Pentagon's priorities are.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly, sorry, George, just wanted to quickly touch upon the Doug Kurth part of the story, because he was vectored in to intercept an object, and he saw the whitewash that Commander Fravor also witnessed, but he didn't see the craft. But it seems to suggest that it may have been cloaked or invisible. Was it seen on radar while he was at that location? Do you know?
That level of resolution has never been uncovered, because all of the data that was associated with that Tic Tac case was not made available to us 100%. Only partially was it made available to us. So we didn't have the full data to go on.
Wow, that's interesting. Sorry, George, anything to add to that?
Vinnie, when we were kicking around possible titles for this book, how different it was from Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, I had thrown out the idea, maybe we should call it Nuts and Bolts. And then Colm very astutely pointed out, we don't want to have the word nuts in a UFO book because it might be seen as a slam at the audience. But Nuts and Bolts sort of describes how this is different from the other one, is it is physical characteristics. UFO world is always demanding evidence. Show us the data. Well, this is data. These are, we take physics and aerodynamic concepts and then add cases to all of those things. All the stuff that was laid out in the DIRDs, the Defense Intelligence Research Documents, 38 reports for OSAP, that was sort of a baseline of where the study was going to go. And Jim Lakatsky and Colm used that baseline in this book to sort of lay out how UFOs operate and where they demonstrate particular characteristics of lift and propulsion. And each of those includes a case from history. And we went back to a lot of older cases because so there is no confusion. Was this a Russian drone? Was this Chinese spy craft or something? These are older cases that demonstrate really pretty weird and characteristics that these craft are able to perform that we can't do to this date. Right, Colm?
Yes, I would completely agree with that. There's some real classic cases that are in under the various topics. The book is broken out into like the main 4 topics of lift, propulsion, power generation, and spatial translation. But under things like lift, you've got a sort of a lot of electromagnetic aspects of that too. And we quote some really classic cases. I guess my favorite is that 1957 case from southern United States, the RB-47 case, because it's been so incredibly well documented. I think there's even papers in the AIAA regarding the RB-47 case. But bottom line is that this object was really brightly lit, very, very well sort of seen by the crew of this RB-47 as it traversed Texas and Louisiana, and I think it ended up in Oklahoma. And during that time, they had a lot of sophisticated counterintelligence equipment and also electromagnetic detection on board the RB-47. So it was, again, one of these cases that's made in heaven, that it's not just sort of seeing a bright light in the sky. They documented really, really powerful radio waves coming out of this, microwaves coming out off this. And, they documented it probably was in the kilowatt range. So it was a a pretty substantial amount of power being utilized in the RB-47 case. Not only that, but it was also seen on the ground, both visually and also by radar. So you've got a lot of triangulation. So, and back in July of 1957, as George said, China wasn't flying balloons over the United States at that stage, and that we know of at least. And Russia certainly was not deploying all these drones. So, you've got a really sort of good ground truth from which to compare, the characteristics, the aerodynamic characteristics of UFOs. And there are a lot of different cases like that in the book, that we deliberately go back to cases that are not to be confused with, modern day unknowns.
Some of it, Vinny, is technical and goes right over my pointy little head. But they do it. I think Colm and Jim do a good job of boiling it down so non-technical people can understand it. For example, there's a case that we know about landing site trace cases where people see something land in a field and there's physical evidence left. They take it a step further. There's a case from Leeds in the early 2000s where two police officers saw a UFO land in a field, and then investigators went and saw there's physical evidence, broken twigs and branches, but also a heavy indentation where this thing set down. It's like 50 feet wide and 18 feet thick. It set down in a field, and it obviously was heavy. Whatever it was heavy because it left a big indentation, but it took off with ease. There's no propulsion, no wings, no plumes, no exhaust. How does it do it? It demonstrates there's a technology there that we do not understand. And each of the physical principles in the book is accompanied by an example like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many cases that seem to kind of fit under that category as well. But when just sticking with the DIRDs, because one of the Lakatsky's other statements he made on weaponized was that if people are aware as to why the DIRDs were written, that in his words, it would floor people. I just wondered if either of you could expand on that or give us any hints as to why he sort of used those words and what he may have meant by it.
Well, generically, I can speak to that generically. So, at the very beginning of this program, there was a sort of a request for what would your favorite topics be, that went out to all of the agencies on JWICS, which is the TSSCI classified network. And so the DIRDs, or the 12 subjects that came back, were the rough umbrella subjects that people wanted covered in terms of what would be your dream UFO study, would it look like. So all of that eventually made its way into a request for proposals that named those 12 subject categories. So that was the sort of origin of the 12 characteristics. So the DIRDs are sort of a reflection of that. It is sort of what is from the perspective of multiple agencies in the United States government, multiple departments in the United States government, what is the dream topics that really need to be looked at from a physics perspective? And so, the physics, Project Physics, was born out of that series of requests. And so Project Physics attempted to look at those 12 subject categories and then project into the future what would be, what would the cockpit of the future look like from a perspective of a pilot, 40 or 50 years hence. And the object of Project Physics was to get as advanced baseline as possible in order to start evaluating that, baseline against observable UFO characteristics that would be coming into the database that the OSAP was gathering. So it was an attempt essentially to lay the groundwork for what would eventually become observables, but also theoretical physics. How does theoretical physics match with projections from multiple experts all around the world into, spatial temporal travel, wormholes, faster than light travel. All of these exotic concepts that, will probably be reality, from a physics point of view in 30 or 40 years. So that was the genesis of Project Physics. But, Lekatsky has a lot more under his hat. What I'm giving you is a sort of a generic explanation. But, Lekatsky is not known for, going out and putting out a lot of details that have not been sanctioned.
The DIRDs, Vinnie, the DIRDs were always supposed to be a baseline too, as a baseline for, okay, here's what our technology is now. Here's what we think it will be in 50 years. It's a baseline by which you can compare UFO cases. So a UFO data comes in. We don't have that technology now. We don't even know if we'll have it in 50 years. It's somebody else's. It became a basis to judge just how weird some of these cases were. And I remember Colm telling me when they first put them out on JWICs, they were really well received by the defense establishment, defense contractors, people in those lines of work, really well received. They kind of got bashed in the whole UFO disclosure movement because they didn't go far enough, but they were really well received. And I think if people take a fresh look at them now, they'd see how important that work was back then.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Absolutely. Now, one of the other major projects within OSAP seemed to be Project Colaris, this big case from the 70s and multiple decades. And it seemed that at the end of it was the UFOs seen were completely unmatchable with any Earth-based technologies. And what was it that made you kind of go outside of the US, though, to look at a case? Because surely there was an abundance of US-based cases.
Well, I guess one of the remits for OSAP was, threat analysis. And so we looked around at the various UFO cases, and we were asking the question, is there evidence for a threat from UFOs that is based on their behavior, based on their performance, based on their activities? So naturally, our attention was drawn to this series of Colaris events that went over, we documented about 4 to 6 months, but I've heard that these Colaris events went on for maybe a year. The other part of it was that the Brazilian Air Force intelligence got wind of the Colaris events, and they deployed people on the beach. For 4 to 6 months, you had UFOs of all shapes and sizes that were descending on this small island off the northeast coast of Brazil. And they were sort of injuring people. There was a lot of hunters on the island who were used to spotlighting deer, and they used to, shine these lights at deer. And sort of once the deer got transfixed by the light, they would kill them. Standard way of doing it in Brazil. I believe that's illegal here in the United States, but that's another question. But, suddenly these hunters in trees were getting spotlighted from above them by these objects. And it was like the hunters became the hunted. They got spotlighted by these really bright lights. They got badly burned. There was these sort of impressions on their skin all over that looked like very large diameter cigarette burns. And, a lot of people got injured. There was documentation that people got killed during this, this wave of UFOs. And it wasn't just disc-shaped or sort of a certain size. It was a whole plethora of objects of different sizes and shapes that were documented. They went into the water. They came out of the water around this island. So, it was transmedium travel, even though that particular phrase was not well used back in the 1970s. So there was a doctor on the island who documented all these injuries. And, we sent a team over to Brazil, part of the OSAP program, in order to start investigating in the northeastern Brazil, because at the time, back in 2009, there was a lot of activity being reported, not in Colaris, but in Fortaleza, which was a locality in northeast of Brazil. So we sent teams over to northeastern Brazil. We also sent teams over to Brasilia, which is the capital. And so we were interacting with the political people in Brasilia, while we were also had a separate team that included Brazilian or Portuguese translators in the northeastern part of the country. And we gathered gigabytes upon gigabytes of interview transcripts and video transcripts and that whole thing, brought them back. And we had 2 to 3 different Portuguese translators going through this. In addition, we were extremely lucky to have all of the original interview transcripts that Bob Pratt, who is a legend in the UFO community, had spent a lot of time in Brazil, specifically interviewing Colares witnesses. And he wrote a book, I think it's called UFO Danger in Brazil. But that book is really worth looking at because it documents the extent of injuries and deaths that happened to these people on this small island. So, you know, from the OSAP perspective, this series of events in Colares did fit the bill of, you know, are UFOs a threat? Because in this particular case, it was pretty unambiguous that hunting and injuring and killing humans does constitute a threat.
It is an outlier, though. Colares is an outlier in the big picture, as these guys learned. However, they documented one of the DIRDs. I think the principal author of that was Dr. Kit Green. He explores the much broader picture of UFO-related injuries, most of them happening by people who get into the proximity of UFO, get too close to it, as opposed to being targeted specifically. But I mean, the cases that he's got, in contrast to what we heard from Arrow a couple days ago, we've seen no evidence of UFO injuries. Well, all he has to do, Sean Kirkpatrick should walk across the street and down the road to DIA and get this report, because that DIRD outlines a significant number, hundreds of cases of injuries in association with people who got too close to UFOs. Might not have been on purpose, but they're real. In addition, the human effects that Colm and his colleagues explored, and that we touched on in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, are these strange, really weird diseases that pop up, immune deficiency diseases that almost no one has ever heard of before, that happen to people who interact with UFOs. It's really strange, but really well documented. Kit Green and other colleagues followed some of these cases for a couple of years, and it's scary. It's not like the UFO knots, whoever they are, wherever they're from, are doing it on purpose, but there's undeniable evidence that this is real.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one thing with relating to the Colares cases, is I did an interview with Lou Elizondo a couple of years ago, and he stated that he worked on the Colares case and met with military individuals. Would that have been under OSAP before he branched out with ATIP?
We weren't aware of. Lou Elizondo was not on the teams that we assembled for OSAP that was sent to Brazil, but you know, he may well have done it, you know, under different auspices, but it was not as part of the OSAP program. But you know, that this whole sort of injury versus you know, being in the wrong place at the wrong time, that was something that we looked at carefully. And as George rightly says, the Colares events were very much an anomaly. You know, we documented a lot of medical injury cases, but you know, we were never able to really nail it down that were people in the right place or in the wrong place at the wrong time, or what were these deliberate? You know, there was a case we documented in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon when, you know, these 3 bright objects were seen by this guy driving it north towards Bend, Oregon. And, you know, his daughter was in the car. She saw these brightly lit UFOs darting around the field. They came into the car. They came right at the car, came right into the car, went through his left shoulder, went right in front of the daughter as she was looking terrified, you know, at what these objects were doing. But you know, one of these went through his left shoulder, exited his right shoulder, and then went out the window of the vehicle. And so he came down with a lot of, lost his hair, had really bad sunburn, had metallic taste in his mouth, had a lot of really weird immunological sequelae, had a burst of cancer in that area, where the object had gone through. So eventually recovered after multiple years. But I mean, that was an extremely traumatic event. And, we had MD, PhD physician scientists who were on staff who were documenting all this stuff. And, this object going through this individual, was that just happenstance? Or was this a deliberate sort of attack? It seemed to the daughter, as she was looking at these objects, that these objects, immediately she saw them, made a beeline for the car. So from her testimony, it would seem that they were targeting the car. But, we were never able to nail it down to say that, the agenda of these UFOs was to target people as opposed to being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, you're talking there about more sort of plasma-based orbs rather than solid objects. But, in recent years, we've been seeing these solid orbs a lot of the times in Middle East conflict zones, as Jeremy and George have kind of brought forward recently. But were there any actual kind of conclusions made as to what orbs may represent as opposed to your regular kind of shaped UFOs?
We documented a lot of different orbs in a lot of different cases. And, they definitely had really spectacular electromagnetic effects. They also, we documented different orbs all the way going back to the NIDS organization back in the late 90s on Skinwalker Ranch. We documented blue orbs and red orbs and white orbs. They all seem to have different capabilities. And, one of those capabilities was being able to instill extreme fear in witnesses that were standing by. And, that's a sort of an aggressive, hostile, I'd say act. People who are feeling extreme fear. Other cases, they incinerated dogs on the Skinwalker Ranch, 3 dogs that were essentially just incinerated by these blue orbs. We had another case during the OSAP program out in Maryland, where one of the guys who had been on Skinwalker Ranch had brought back activity with him to his home in, I believe it was Maryland. He was and his wife were walking the dog out, in their neighborhood one evening, shortly after he had arrived home from Skinwalker Ranch. And, his wife was extremely athletic, extremely, fit, never had, had barely had a cold in the last 10 years. And, this blue orb was flying down the road in this quiet neighborhood in Maryland. They had never seen anything like it, but it came really close to them and it actually grazed this guy's wife's shoulder. And so within a few hours of that incident, she began to feel really unwell. And she kind of came down with a constellation of symptoms. And it took them, months and months of going to specialists, going to doctors. And eventually, they showed that this was a rare autoimmune disease that she had come down with called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which, causes a constellation of medical symptoms. But this woman was a marathon runner. I mean, she was a paragon of health before this happened. And, for months afterwards, she was absolutely floored because of this close encounter with, an object.
That's yeah. I mean, that just doesn't make sense, does it? Really? And that's standout. George, any theories on the orbs in the Middle East? You've been looking at those a lot in the last year or two. Have you heard of any more cases or anything?
Yeah, there are other cases. Our U.S. military has other cases and has images of other cases. Obviously, they look like probes of some sort. It's some kind of a surveillance platform. We've seen them over our bases throughout the Middle East. and other places of the world have no idea who's launching them, who's flying them, where they come from, where they go to. No idea. It kind of harkens back to the USS Omaha off the west coast of the US, 2019. 10 US warships are buzzed by more than 100 objects, different sizes and shapes. Among them were these really big orbs. And calling them orbs might be an understatement, since some of the things around the USS Omaha were about 12 to 14 feet in diameter. No wings, no rotors, no exhaust. They followed along the ship. There were 14 of them at one point, zipping in and out. You could see them detected on radar, and then they disappear. One of them that was captured on that thermal image in the command center of the USS Omaha followed for an hour, and then it went into the water. And where did it come from? They have no idea. Where did it go? They have no idea. It wasn't a Chinese drone. It didn't come off the Bass Straits. They have no idea who launched it, what it was doing there. It's not ours. We don't have anything that can do what it did. Whose was it? Where did it come from? Supposedly it's Chinese drones. We wish we had drones that could do what those did.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, surely this is the kind of work that Arrow should be doing, looking into these more recent cases. I mean, what are your thoughts on the way that things seem to be going with the Arrow situation? Because, they've been mandated to do so much, yet we're just not really seeing or hearing anything from them.
Well, I don't have a good feeling about it. I read this latest report, and there are some encouraging nuggets in there that they are doing some work. They're finally getting up and running. I think Sean Kirkpatrick said they've got around 40 people working for them now, which is great. They have all the authority they presumably could use, but it seems like it has a feeling of the Edward Condon kind of a vibe, Project Blue Book kind of a vibe. We're going to explain these things away, and the ones we can't explain, they're not all that important. They're down to like 2 to 4% are truly inexplicable. I guess if they admit that at least some of those are inexplicable, that's great. Let's focus on those things and figure out what they are, not try to explain it all away, which seems to be what they're doing. Seems to be they're trying their best to make this problem go away, to make the public and Congress lose interest. I've seen this show before. I've seen this movie before, and I don't like how it ends. Colm?
Yeah, I would agree. The initial remit for Arrow was under the umbrella of the Office of USDI and Security, which is actually charged with disseminating, anything but the truth regarding UFOs. I mean, the idea is, as an oversight function, they are not in the business of explaining to the American people or the global audience what UFOs are doing or how much the US knows. So Arrow was under the auspices of USDI for a long time. During the OSAP program, we ran into USDI, which was called USDI at the time, and all of the sort of focus was on trying to limit the amount of information that was being accessed and limit the amount of information that was being put out. But recently, now that the Arrow is reporting directly to Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks, there's maybe an additional room for optimism because under the auspices of USDI, I really I was not very optimistic. The second point about this report, when they talk about no medical effects, there's almost no detail there. And so, the question is, did they take some pilot testimony from objects that were like 50 miles away? They were seen from a distance. Were these objects 50 miles away? Were they 5 miles away? Were they 500 meters away? There's really no detail about how they actually evaluated medical effects. The OSAP program documented medical effects from close encounter interactions with UFOs. These things were up close and personal. We have no idea what Arrow are doing in terms of following up on medical effects. And the other thing is, are they interviewing, say, pilots over a weekend and then just kind of dropping it? Or are they following these people over days and weeks and maybe months in order to generate data that would rule out medical effects, because the OSAP program did follow people for months, actually in some cases years, regarding the effects of injury cases, medical injury cases. So we have no way of knowing what the ARROW people are doing from the perspective of documenting that there are no medical effects or no health effects. I mean, without more details, it's impossible to evaluate that statement.
I can add this, Vinnie, is the statements that Sean Kirkpatrick has made in public has absolutely destroyed the credibility of ARROW in the eyes of whistleblowers, people who worked for the U.S. government in sensitive positions, some of whom are still working for the U.S. government, who've had hands-on experience with technology, physical evidence, who have been willing to come forward, but now have to be wondering, is this a good idea? Sean Kirkpatrick says he's seen no evidence of any ET technology, nothing that defies the laws of physics. He's had this information from Dave Grush and others. He has access to it. He said he has access to everything. What does that say? That he does not find them to be credible? Does that encourage other whistleblowers to come forward and speak to ARROW? I can tell you for sure it does not. The people who had considered coming forward and speaking to that organization want nothing to do with it anymore. Nothing to do with it at all.
Yeah, I think one thing that I find concerning is that they're now saying that they're going to be implementing a military reporting system with ARROW and leading into a civilian reporting system. And it wouldn't surprise me if through the civilian one, especially, that they may start seeing a lot more cases of high strangeness and not just your kind of military encounters. But what are they going to do with it? Is it just going to be all entered into a database and sit there? Or are they going to be like OSAP and actually get boots on the ground and try and investigate it? I think that's where the bit of my worry comes in. Any thoughts on that?
I would completely agree with what you've just said. There's a world of difference from downloading data from classified sensors, which is, relatively easy to do once you get the authorities and the appropriate classification. You download all of the sensor data and you put it into artificial intelligence analysis programs, and you then make the call: is there enough data to make some kind of an evaluation? And a lot of the time the system will spit out there's not enough data, because a lot of these events are very transient. And then the other part of this is you're interviewing pilots, and you're getting testimony from pilots, both military and civilian. I mean, I was heartened to see that they are starting to get reports from the Federal Aviation Administration in terms of civilian cases. But there's a real world of difference between sitting in an office and sort of getting these kinds of reports either over the telephone or over Zoom calls, and getting out and interviewing people out in the heartland of the United States that have had close encounters, and getting the equipment together in order to, gather physical evidence on the ground, indentations, effects on foliage, effects on, the environment in general. That's a very, very different prospect from, sitting in your office and sort of pressing a few buttons on a keyboard and analyzing classified data, which is, it is part of the whole process, but it certainly shouldn't be all of the process. You have to get a fully equipped, boots on the ground group of people who are investigating cases both in the United States and elsewhere. I don't know if ARROW has actually done that. I mean, between the different programs that evolved out of the UAP task force, that evolved into AOI MSG and then eventually into ARROW, you've got 3+ years now, which is a lot longer than OSAP was operating. And, there's plenty of time to have recruited a top flight team of going out and investigating, taking eyewitness testimony, but also sampling the environment for cases or for evidence of UFO activity, and then ultimately asking the question: do these UFO have effects on humans? I'm not convinced that Arrow have gone that final straw. And, I will make the case once again that if you combine all of what was written in Skinwalkers at the Pentagon and all of what was written in this new book, Initial Revelations, I would make the case that the OSAP program is a really good template upon which to base a UFO program. I mean, we actually state in our Initial Revelations book, and we have a table in which we document what the OSAP characteristics were, and we match it against the Arrow characteristics, and there's almost a perfect match, apart from the boots on the ground investigations. Because if you don't do that, you're sort of sequestering into a narrow sort of silo of data that you may never actually transcend.
I'll add this, is that you will never solve the UFO mystery just by studying lights in the sky and radar returns. You need that information for sure, but you need to have boots on the ground. You have to have investigators who interact with the witnesses and hear what they have to say. I mean, if no one had gone to Skinwalker Ranch and you just had occasional cases of sighting reports, orbs and craft, no one would have ever collected all the additional information. You have to be willing to embrace the woo. You don't have to believe it all, but it comes hand in hand. There's no getting around it. I know Jim Lakatsky catches a lot of grief for things that he said, but the fact is those things do go hand in hand. Not every case, but a lot of those cases, you have to be willing to listen to what the witnesses say and what happens on the ground. And if you only look at UFO data and radar returns, you're never going to figure this thing out.
Yeah, that's true. Do you think there should be more focus on some of the agencies outside of your military branches and that, maybe like Homeland Security? Is there something there that we kind of should be looking at more, or do you think that they've got any information that they're maybe withholding?
I'll let Colm answer that one.
Well, we interacted a lot with Homeland Security. At the time, they had a undersecretary of science and technology. Her name was Dr. Tara O'Toole. We spent a lot of time interacting with her because we were proposing that a follow-up program to OSAP could actually be located at Department of Homeland Security. So, we spent a lot of time going back and forth to Washington, D.C., to Homeland Security. We had a lot of meetings. And, we got to know a lot of these people pretty well. And at the time, we thought that they were an extremely capable group of people that were capable of launching a UFO program under the auspices of Department of Homeland Security. Now, Jim Lakatsky spent an enormous time at Department of Homeland Security interacting with more people than we did, from Las Vegas. We had Robert Bigelow, we had myself going out from Las Vegas. Jim Lakatsky spent a lot of time at Department of Homeland Security. And, the bottom line was that we interacted really well and there was a lot of potential. Fast forward to 2023, I have a question mark about whether or not there is the same capabilities. I don't know if that same team, I know Dr. Tara O'Toole has long since left Department of Homeland Security. I believe she's with InQtel now with the CIA program for venture capital. But she was an instigator. She was highly interested in the medical cases. And at the time, we thought Department of Homeland Security had a lot of potential.
It takes courage to follow the evidence where it leads. I mean, the woo factor, the paranormal aspect of this is off-putting for a lot of scientific folks. People like Colm with a PhD, Jim Lakatsky with 2 PhDs. Do you want to be associated with what people perceive to be ghost hunting, with dino beavers, with cryptid creatures and crop circles and animal mutilations? No one willingly takes that on. You take it on because you follow the evidence, and that's where it leads. And I'm not sure that anyone in Washington right now has the appetite for that, something like that, but that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, and it seems there's a kind of a major focus on the Schumer Amendment and what may get passed at the end of the year in the National Defense Authorization Act for next year. Do you have any confidence in this 9-body panel that may lead to being, some kind of disclosure panel?
Well, I know that the original wording of the Schumer Amendment was created a wave of optimism as it rippled through the UFO community. But I mean, we know absolutely that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the main Congressman Mike Turner, whose congressional district is a Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, have been doing the rounds of Congress and making a very, very strong case that the Schumer Amendment is going to torpedo national security. And when you've got people with the power of Secretary of Defense of Lloyd Austin, who is directly trying to influence Congress people in a negative way, that does not sort of lead to a lot of optimism that what the National Defense Authorization Act will contain the full language of the Schumer Amendment. I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of power and a lot of behind the scenes pressure being applied to stop the flow of congressional hearings and to stop the flow of openness and transparency that was sort of implied by the congressional hearing in July.
The pushback is unfolding before our eyes in real time right now. It is underway. I am a pessimist, glass is half empty guy. So when I saw the Schumer legislation, I thought, wow, that's great. I'll believe it when I see it, because the power of the Pentagon on Capitol Hill is tremendous. The power of defense contractors, there's a defense base pretty much in every congressional district. They have tremendous influence. They hand out a lot of money. And although we have some champions in Congress who want to move this ball forward, they are up against tremendous odds. The fact is, Vinnie, the keepers of the secrets, the people who have kept this bottled up for all these years, 75 plus years, are better at their job than we are at our job. And I would never underestimate them. It looks like we've got a lot of momentum right now, but there have been peaks and valleys of public interest and congressional interest before. Something always comes along that becomes more of a front burner issue than UFOs.
Yeah, that's the truth. Absolutely. I mean, we hear, that there are whistleblowers waiting behind the scenes to come forward as well, but we've not really heard or seen anything of that actually happening. Is that something we should remain hopeful for, or is it time to kind of look elsewhere for momentum?
Well, I would suggest that the climate in Washington, D.C., especially the climate with Arrow and what George has just talked about in terms of the pushback, I would say it's not a particularly favorable climate to whistleblowers coming forward, because in the end, if people have TSSCI clearances, you will have a pretty severe counterintelligence backlash at anybody who comes forward. And the idea that somehow Congress can legislate sort of amnesties and all of this, a lot of the intelligence agencies are powers unto themselves, and they've been doing this a long, long time. So, and a lot of people in the intelligence agencies are not particularly enamored of Congress telling them, what to do, kind of thing. So I would say that the ground is not very fertile right now for whistleblowers coming forward. I think Dave Grush was an exception, and what he did obviously opened a lot of doors. But I don't see a rush of people to follow in his footsteps, and for the reasons I've just outlined. I think the behind the scenes, what's happening there is not giving a favorable climate to whistleblowers.
what's happening in Congress, it's a mess. The House of Representatives is a mess. They can't pick a Speaker of the House. And once they do pick a Speaker of the House, we're going to be right up against a deadline to shut down the U.S. government. And then they want to impeach President Biden. There are a lot of other things that are a complete mess in Washington that are more on the front burner than UFO secrecy and transparency ever will be. You combine with that, people like Dave Grush comes forward, he immediately gets slimed. That it serves as a lesson to other potential whistleblowers. Look, you better not have a skeleton in your closet, because this is what's waiting for you. Nonetheless, I think there are some other people who are going to have the courage to come forward, and we're going to be hearing about them within the next 10 to 12 months.
Right. I mean, you and Jeremy, George, have both been have presented information, let's say, in images in the last couple of years. If there's any time, if you got anything up your sleeve, it might be a good time to give us an early Christmas present to put some cheer back into the community.
Stay tuned.
Okay, that's interesting. Yep. So I've got a couple of questions from some other researchers. So my last question really would be, looking at the new book overall, it's obvious that there was a line that could be sort of hit and, nobody could sort of cross over it. So if you were to sort of say to people, is there an area in there where we should read between the lines maybe more than anywhere else?
Well, I guess that statement from Dr. Lakatsky in 2011 does have the potential of reading between the lines. But people have said, on the internet and in the various social media, that OSAP was not really a UFO program, that it was more like a sort of a project Blue Book, or a sort of an organization that was really writing white papers, and it really had nothing to do with the UFO topic. Well, I think both of the books that we have published with Jim Lakatsky and with George Knapp have really laid bare that this was a UFO program. There's no ambiguity whatsoever. When meetings were held in Washington, D.C. or in Las Vegas, Nevada, it was unambiguous that this was a UFO program. And, the idea of sort of smearing it as a sort of an exercise in writing white papers is totally false. I mean, you don't need to read between the lines, I think, in order to garner that sort of information.
Again, I would say, look, people have been asking for data, for specific examples that document particular characteristics and performance capabilities of UFOs. This does it. It takes them one by one and gives you an example of a real life case that demonstrated a unique characteristic, a performance characteristic that we cannot duplicate even now, 50 years later after some of these cases. So there's a lot of data, a lot of evidence. You got to be willing to take it all in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a couple more questions here. So the first one actually comes from Grant Cameron. If I can find it. Grant asks, do the disclosures in this book have the authorization for release from President Biden? Did he sign off on the recovered craft story, or is Lakatsky a rogue former government official doing his own thing?
Well, it was signed off by the Office of Pre-Publication of the Pentagon. The Office of Pre-Publication of the Pentagon eventually reports all the way up the chain. But I mean, the idea that President Biden personally looked and read and even understood what was in this book, I would question that. So, I would say that every part of the content of this book was put out to different agencies, including DHS, including DIA, and other agencies. And what came back, what we were able to publish, is sanctioned by those agencies.
It took 7 months.
The book stops with the President of the United States, but
right.
Did he read the book? I would very much doubt it.
It took 7 months to get DOPSR approval, so it floated around between different agencies, and then they signed off on it with some changes. The last book took 14 months to get approval. There were a lot of changes that had to be made, mostly names of people and locations of people. But yeah, this got approval. Lakatsky had permission to say as much as he said, but he could not go any further.
So yeah, Rich Hoffman of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies has a number of questions. His first being, why are we hearing this now?
The OSAP program was broken in 2017 under the auspices of what was called ATIP in the New York Times story. In October of 2021, the the skinwalkers at the Pentagon broke the OSAP story. 2 years later, the follow-up in terms of what the physics and the engineering aspects of what the OSAP program was published in October of 2023. To me, that's a logical evolution in time.
It's possible that if Rich is asking about the particular revelation on the craft that Lakatsky refers to, it's possible that would not have been approved the first go round when we had the Doppler process for skinwalkers at the Pentagon. We did drop some breadcrumbs in that book that is what these guys were on the trail of. I mean, the OSAP program, Bigelow Aerospace made modifications to the plant, to its aerospace plant, in anticipation of receiving certain materials. They were ready to get those materials. They never got them. They went in search of those materials, exotic stuff, presumably. And when they did, they got the door slammed in their face. We went as far as we could in that book to tell that story. Now, perhaps because other people have come forward with statements on the record about crash retrievals and reverse engineering, they were a little more lenient in allowing Lakatsky to make that statement. That's my guess.
And that's interesting because if Lakatsky had that meeting on Capitol Hill in 2011, and yet OSAP was prior to that, and if they were setting up to potentially receive some craft, that they must have been highly suspicious or suspecting that these legacy programs were out there. They must have seen or heard something.
Well, for sure. That's in the book. It's a little bit veiled, I think, in the language we used in Skinwalkers of the Pentagon, but it's very clear that was the suspicion among the OSAP personnel, Lakatsky and Colm and others, and that they were hot on the trail of this stuff. They wanted to see it. You guys said we could see it. Where is it? And door got slammed in their face.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know if Colm wants to add to that.
And the original proposal that Bigelow Aerospace Advanced Space Studies put out to DIA did mention that BAS, which was going to potentially execute the OSAP program, had an interest in these, which was common knowledge right across the board of reverse engineering of objects.
Interesting.
And that was part of the original proposal that was put into the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Yeah. So another question from Rich. Many people like Davis, Putoff, and others you were close to are puzzled why you never mentioned the re-engineering of NHI craft to them. How do you account for this? They had clearances as well.
I think that's a question for Dr. Lakatsky.
Okay. But I'd point out that both Hal and Eric have made their own statements about recovered craft and reverse engineering and exotic materials, metamaterials. They're not completely in the dark about the existence of that material.
Right, fair enough. And finally, I think this one will be for you, Colm. Would you testify under oath if asked?
Depends on the parameters, and depends to who. I'm open to talking under oath, but I'm also aware of the various shenanigans that are going on right now. So I will adhere to my non-disclosure agreements, and I will not go any further than that unless I'm absolutely certain that is the way to go.
No, that's fair enough. I appreciate that. Thank you. So I guess my final question, this is the third book that you've written, you've co-authored. Are we likely to see a fourth anytime in the future?
George?
Over my dead body. No, yes. The answer is yes. Dr. Lakatsky has already dropped some hints about that. We know that he's working on something. and that we've been invited to participate. So yeah, there's still a lot more to tell.
Fantastic. Sure. That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Well, Colm, George, I really appreciate you sitting down with me today and sort of taking some time out on your Sundays. It's much appreciated. So thank you.
Thanks, Vinnie.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye.